What's the hardest thing you've had to forgive, or never could?
My parents did not come to my wedding because my sister had decided her boyfriend needed a surprise party, and while I would love to tell you I made a scene or begged them to rethink it, what actually happened was quieter and meaner to the heart because I smiled, said that I understood they were busy, and then walked myself down the aisle with my head high and my stomach tight, telling myself that I was not a child waiting by a window anymore and that I would not spend one more day playing musical chairs for their version of love. I told the officiant to keep it moving, and I told the photographer to focus on the people who showed up, and when my aunt asked where my parents were, I said they were celebrating something important and left it there. Because if I said the whole thing out loud, I might have cried so hard I would not have finished my vows. I married Mark because he is steady and kind and because he never tries to manage me, and when he realized my parents were not walking through those doors, not even late, he squeezed my hand a little longer than usual and said we were fine, which we were. If fine means you can love someone and still feel a bruise forming in a place no one can see. After the ceremony, my sister, whose name is Emily, sent me a text with a balloon emoji and a line about how she hoped my day was magical, and then a photo of her boyfriend pretending to be surprised with a cake that said something about forever, which, if you have ever been the less shiny sibling, lands like a coin tossed in your empty jar with a smile that says you should be grateful anyone noticed you at all. I did not reply, because there is no version of thank you that covers being replaced by a room full of strangers yelling surprise at a grown man who already knew, since they had parked in front of his house like a parade. Later that night, my mom left a voicemail that was long and full of excuses that sounded like apologies if you have never heard a real one, and she said they thought my wedding would be small and that we could always do a redo, and that she did not want to make Emily feel abandoned because the boyfriend's friends had put so much effort in, as if effort is a currency that only spends in one direction, and at the very end she said, "We will make it up to you, sweetheart, someday." Which is a sentence you only hear when someone is confident the bill will never come due. I saved that voicemail, not because I planned to use it for anything, but because I wanted proof that the version of the story living in my chest was not a dream I made up to feel wronged, and when I pressed save I felt something settle that had been rattling for years. The weeks after were a mess of relatives telling me to be the bigger person and friends trying to keep me angry enough to protect myself, and I did the only thing that felt sane, which was to stop campaigning for the job of daughter and start acting like a woman with a life, which meant setting boundaries that did not come with a lecture or a threat. Just a gentle no and a calendar that did not bend around people who could not be bothered to show up once. I blocked Emily's habit of sending me little digs wrapped in glitter by muting her on everything, and I told Mark that we were going to celebrate our marriage our way. Not with a pity party or a second ceremony or a manufactured photo album that pretended the first day did not happen the way it did. Then, because I am petty in a way that keeps my blood pressure in the human range, I mailed thank you cards to every person who attended our wedding, and I mailed one more stack to the guests at Emily's party, all of whom had posted their excitement under her photo. And inside each card, I wrote a gracious line about how happy I was that my parents had such a wonderful time celebrating love that day, and how I appreciated them taking care of my parents while I was, coincidentally, getting married. It was not cruel and it was not loud, but it traveled, and within a week my mother called me to say that the cards were unnecessary and that people were confused. And I told her I agreed that confusion was the problem and that clarity is free if you tell the truth. She hung up without saying goodbye, which is a little family tradition I have started treating like a period at the end of a sentence. What I did not expect, while I was practicing the art of polite distance and learning that peace is quiet but not empty, was the call that came from a number I did not recognize. A woman with a calm voice introducing herself as someone from my grandparents' attorney's office, asking if I could come in for a meeting regarding family matters and paperwork they had been holding onto for a long time. And while I kept my tone even and said yes, because that is what adults say, I felt something shift. The way a locked door sometimes clicks before you touch it. The next day I told Mark I needed to handle it alone, which he accepted without taking it personally, and as I drove to that office with the message from my mother still saved on my phone and the thank you cards already doing their quiet work, I realized I might finally be done asking for a seat at a table that keeps moving. When I walked into the lobby and gave my name, the receptionist pressed a button, the door buzzed, and before I stepped through, my mother's number lit up my screen with a new message that began, "Honey, we should talk, because there are things you do not understand." The receptionist buzzed me into the attorney's office, and a woman with a calm face and a voice that had clearly delivered delicate news many times invited me to sit. And she started with small talk about how my grandparents were meticulous people who believed in writing everything down because feelings fade while paper keeps its shape. And then she slid a slim folder toward me and explained that there were letters and instructions that would make more sense if I could be patient, because a formal family meeting had been scheduled for a day not far from now, and although I wanted to ask 100 direct questions, I kept my hands in my lap and listened while this stranger treated me like a grown woman who did not need to beg for clarity she was going to get anyway. She said we would gather with my parents and my sister at a neutral location, that there would be a reading and some administrative steps, and that I should expect pressure, charm, and a sudden flood of nostalgia from people who had not found me worthy of the same when it would have mattered, and hearing a lawyer say that out loud made me feel less crazy, like I had not invented the pattern just to justify pulling back. When I left the office, I did not call my mother, and I did not text my sister, because the rule I had been practicing since the wedding was to act like my life has weight even when no one else handles it carefully. And instead, I drove to the small coffee place where Mark and I go when things feel complicated, and I told him exactly what the attorney had said. And he reached for my hand and asked if I wanted him in the room for the big meeting or if it would help me to feel like I could do it without the man I married, and I told him I wanted to walk into it alone and then walk out to him waiting, like a visible promise I could touch when the anxiety started pretending to be logic. On the drive home, my phone filled with family chatter that had nothing to do with me, Emily posting a set of photos from another social event where she wrote a caption about chosen family, which is a phrase that people toss around when they want attention without accountability, and I muted her again because I did not need to drink from the same well that had poisoned me for years. That night, my mother texted that she had seen a missed call from a number that looked official, and did I know anything about it, because if there was something I needed help with, she was here for me now. And I laughed out loud in a way that startled Mark because it sounded too sharp, so I told him that laughter and crying used the same door and I had to pick one. And then I sat at the kitchen table with my laptop and I opened a new email, and I pulled up the saved voicemail from my wedding night. The one where my mother said they could always do a redo and someday they would make it up to me, and I stared at the waveform like it was a fossil of the creature that had walked through all my holidays pretending not to shed skin. I did not want to be cruel, and I did not want to be theatrical, but I did want to be precise, so I wrote a short paragraph about how I was willing to talk after they listened to their own message from that night. Because sometimes the kindest way to accelerate the truth is to hold up a mirror and step back, and then I attached the audio file and a small selection of photos from the wedding, the ones where I am smiling without trying, standing between the people who actually came, and I typed a subject line that read, "Someday is now," because if they were going to beg me for a new aisle, they could at least be honest about the aisle they skipped. Before I pressed send, I thought about boundaries disguised as revenge and revenge disguised as boundaries, and how sometimes the cleanest hit is simply refusing to carry the weight that someone else keeps dropping in your arms, and I decided to go one step further. Not with a public blast or a family group spectacle, but with a quiet piece of paperwork that mattered to me more than any performance, so I opened my phone's emergency contact settings, and I removed my parents from the top of the list they had never earned, and I placed Mark first, and then my closest friend second, and I listed the attorney's office number with a note that said, "Call for legal next steps," because it felt right to stop pretending that people who would not show up for my vows should be the first to hear my voice if something went wrong. That change will never trend or travel, but it is a small restoration of order inside a life where I have learned to build my own scaffolding. I sent the email with the voicemail and the photos attached, and I set my phone face down, and I made dinner like a person who does not have to stand in the kitchen of her own life waiting for permission to eat. And when the phone started buzzing with the cadence of someone who had a lot to say and none of it grounded in the facts they were about to hear, I let it hum until the noise stopped, And then I pressed play on the new message and listened to my mother stumble through a fresh version of history where she had meant to come and something got complicated and could we please talk tomorrow because there were things she had never told me about that day, which is the line people use when they feel the ground tilting and they want to build a new floor before anyone notices. I saved that message next to the first one, because the only thing more useful than a single truth is a pair of truths that contradict each other without my help, and I texted the attorney to confirm I would attend the family meeting and that I preferred the neutral location she had suggested, and then, because I am done rehearsing for a role that exhausts me, I picked a neutral location of my own for the conversation that would come first. A quiet public place where everyone behaves better because there are witnesses, and I sent my parents a time and an address with one sentence that said, "I will hear you out once, after you listen to yourselves," and I hit send knowing that by the time we sat down, they would have already heard the sound of their own voices saying the part they now wished to erase. I chose a quiet chain restaurant for the conversation because the lighting is unflattering and the booths are close enough that people pretend to be polite. And when my parents slid into the seat across from me with smiles that were a little too bright for a weekday afternoon, I placed my phone on the table, pressed play on the voicemail from my wedding night, and let my mother listen to her own voice offering me a redo like I was a hair appointment she had canceled for a better lunch. And when the recording ended, I did not explain or accuse or catalog old injuries. I only said that I would see them at the attorney's office and that anything worth saying could wait until the person holding the papers was present, because I was done with the genre of family talk that turns into fog the second it leaves the car. My father cleared his throat like he always does when he wants to sound measured and asked whether this meeting was about my grandparents' house and investments, and I said I would not speculate, and my mother reached across the table with a touch that used to melt me when I was a child, but now felt like a request for a receipt, and she said she misses me and wants to repair things, and I told her I am not broken, which landed between us like a glass that does not tip when you nudge it, because the bottom is finally heavy enough. On the day of the formal meeting, I arrived early because I like to sit in a place before everyone else fills it with their version of what is true, and the attorney greeted me with that calm voice again and offered water and a folder I did not open. And then my parents came in with Emily right behind them, radiating the confidence of someone who has always been the favorite without having to do the work that earns it, and the attorney began with the kind of preamble that keeps people from mishearing the law, outlining that my grandparents had updated their documents after a long period of observation, that the papers had been reviewed by another professional to avoid confusion, and that there were personal letters attached that should be read in the room before copies were released. Emily cut in with a laugh that was supposed to be charming and asked whether we could skip to the exciting part, and the attorney said this is the exciting part, which I admit I enjoyed more than I should have, not because I wanted anyone to hurt, but because I am tired of living in a world where the person interrupting gets to set the tone. The reading was not dramatic, which is what made it hit harder, because it did not lean on spectacle or guilt. It simply stated that my grandparents had chosen to leave the estate in its entirety to me, with the clear instruction that I was under no obligation to share or defend or explain, and that any challenge would trigger a clause that would convert small sentimental bequests into donations to a scholarship fund they had seeded years ago in our family's name. A detail that told me everything about how long they had been watching the household where I grew up while pretending not to notice the slant in the floor. The attorney then opened the letters and read them in order, and mine said that they saw who showed up without being asked and who made their own holidays when they were not invited to the regular ones, that they loved each of us, but would not subsidize unkindness, and that they trusted me to decide how much or how little contact kept my peace intact. My parents' letter was shorter and tougher, stating that love without accountability becomes neglect with better manners, and that they hoped this decision would not be the end of us, but the beginning of something more honest. And while there was no letter to Emily, there was a single line typed on the final page that said the grown children of grown children are not owed by default, which is a sentence that lives rent-free in my mind now whenever someone tries to hand me their claim. Emily went first because she always does, pushing back her chair and telling the room that this was obviously my fault, that I had worked on our grandparents for years with my sad little act of being the overlooked one. And my mother tried to soothe her while watching my face for a flinch she could use, and my father stared at the table in a way that told me he was building a new version of events in which he had always warned my mother, and she had never listened, and I let the whole performance run, because it is easier to see a pattern when it is playing at full volume. When it quieted, I said that I accepted the decision and that I would follow it precisely, that I did not intend to explain myself beyond the words already read, and that I hoped we could all choose the kind of dignity that makes future holidays bearable even if we never celebrate them together again, and the attorney slid a few papers toward me for signatures and witnessed them while my family watched the pen move, like it was siphoning something from their chests. In the hallway, my mother found her voice again and called after me with a sweetness that belongs in a commercial for something you regret buying, telling me that what mattered now was not bitterness, but healing, and that a family celebration would help everyone reset. And when I asked what she meant, she said that we should plan a proper ceremony so they can be there, and so the pictures will show what is real, as if reality obeys her captions, and Emily hissed that if I had any class I would at least consider letting them help plan it, because optics matter when there is property involved. I looked at them, at the woman who has always believed time erases her choices, and at the sister who has never once asked what it costs me to remain polite, and I realized I finally understood what my revenge needed to look like. Not a shout, not a fight, not a courtroom or a viral post, just an agreement delivered with a smile that would travel where it needed to, so I told my mother I would think about a celebration that made sense for everyone, and when she brightened and asked whether that meant a vow renewal in the fall, I said that if they wanted a wedding so badly, we would give them one they would never forget. And then I walked toward the elevator with my phone buzzing in my bag and my mind already arranging pieces on a board they did not know I owned, because the next time they asked me to walk down an aisle, I was going to decide where it led. Once the shock of the will reading turned into a story they could repeat without stuttering, my parents switched to charm the way some people switch lanes without looking. So the calls came early and late with gentle check-ins that sounded like weather reports for a sky they had never watched. The packages arrived with monogrammed napkins and little candles that pretended to be tasteful. And posts appeared on their feeds about family being everything, which would have been sweet if history were a snow globe you could shake until the messy parts floated away, and in the middle of that newly curated tenderness, Emily sent a direct message that said I did not deserve what I had been given and that she would make sure I did not keep it, which I read twice and filed in the back of my mind with the same energy I reserve for fire drills, because I do not confuse noise with danger anymore. When my mother finally said the quiet part out loud and asked that we stage a vow renewal so they could be present and proud and put things right, I told her I would consider it if the event honored the truth rather than dressed it up, and when she chirped that anything was possible, I gave her the kind of conditions that either straighten a spine or send a person running. I said I would choose the location and the guest list, that there would be no photographers hired by them and no staged entrances designed to rewrite the original day, and that the only non-negotiable was a short acknowledgement at the microphone where they would say, in plain language, that they skipped my wedding for a party and that they understood why it hurt, followed by a simple line about doing better because love without accountability is just polite neglect, and I let the silence stretch until my father asked whether that language was necessary because it sounded harsh, and I told him harsh would have been dragging them online or standing up in front of their friends with a slideshow, while what I was offering was a single clear sentence that would allow us to stop arguing about the weather and start acknowledging the roof. My mother eventually said that if this humility would heal the family, then she could say it, and I said good, because there was more. I told them the invitations would position the event as a celebration of our marriage and a quiet launch of the scholarship fund my grandparents had planted years ago, which meant that all gifts would be donations to that fund and that, as hosts, my parents would open the giving with a contribution in their names that reflected both gratitude and recognition, a number I did not say out loud because I wanted them to sit with the idea of generosity before they turned it into a ledger, and I told them that the reply card would include a brief statement for each speaker to approve so the microphones would carry no surprises, and that attendance would require consenting to audio recording because I was done with the kind of family dialogue that evaporates the second anyone feels embarrassed. My father said recording felt aggressive, and I said aggressive is skipping a daughter's vows for a cake that misspelled forever, while record keeping is how adults make sure the story stays straight. I also told them I would be sending a short form for signatures the week before the event, a tidy document written by the attorney that simply affirmed that no one present intended to contest the estate or to harass me about it in private or public. Not because I was afraid of a fight, but because I prefer to remove matches from people who keep waving them over curtains, and when my mother tried to turn that into an insult, I kept my voice steady and said it was a boundary with paper attached. Which is the only kind that has worked in this family. Emily jumped in to say that all of this felt like punishment disguised as reconciliation, and I told her it was reconciliation with guardrails. Which is the only way to keep the car out of the ditch when the driver has a history of mistaking attention for a green light. Then I met with the attorney and laid out the plan without theatrics, asking for language that was clean and enforceable and small enough to sit on a single page, and she smiled in that calm way of hers and said that clarity is protective. And together we created a pair of forms that would ride along with the invitations like seatbelts. I built a simple event page with plain text that told the truth without bile, added a donation link that fed directly into the scholarship account, and uploaded a short note at the top that said the program would include a moment of acknowledgement to honor what had been missed, because grown people can name what happened and still move forward. And then I mailed the thick envelopes to my parents and to Emily and to a carefully chosen list of relatives who had sent me quiet kindness after the first wedding, the kind of people who do not need flash to understand sincerity. Within a day, my mother called crying in that breathy way that used to make me chase her affection, telling me she admired my strength and would sign whatever helped us heal. My father said he would handle the contribution because optics matter when you want the community to know you are not small, and Emily, who could not stand being outside the center of gravity, texted that she would deliver a speech about sisterhood if I allowed her 2 minutes. I approved the time limit, I sent the forms, and I waited, and when the signed documents returned with quick signatures and hurried hearts, I booked the venue named for my grandparents, and I told the coordinator that there would be a ceremonial walk down the aisle exactly once, that the aisle would lead somewhere a little different than expected, and that at the end of that walk, under the same last name carved into the building where those two people taught me what loyalty actually looks like, my parents would finally get to say the words they had spent years avoiding, while I decided, in real time and in front of witnesses, whether their apology bought them a future seat at my table or only a polite wave from the door. The day of the so-called redo arrived with a kind of weather that made everyone polite on the road, and I drove to the venue with my dress zipped without fuss and my speech folded neatly in my bag. Not because I needed to read it, but because paper has a way of making promises real. The hall had been arranged to look like a wedding, but stripped of the illusions that accompany them, so there were rows of chairs, a modest arch, a microphone, and a table set up for donations that had already begun to fill with checks sealed in envelopes. Because the scholarship fund had moved people more than I expected, and part of me wished my grandparents could have seen that the money they seeded had turned into a garden without any of the weeds that usually sprout when families gather. My parents arrived in coordinated outfits, glowing with the performance of people who believe this time they will rewrite the headline, and Emily floated behind them with a smile that had too many teeth, as if she already believed the event would be her stage. Guests filled the chairs slowly, cousins I had not spoken to in years, neighbors who remembered my grandparents fondly, and a handful of friends from my own life who had seen me cry after the first wedding, but never asked me to rewrite the story to make anyone else comfortable. When the time came, I did not walk down the aisle like a bride. I walked straight to the microphone with Mark seated in the front row watching me with that steady kindness that steadies me in return. And I began by thanking the people who had come not to watch a redo, but to witness a correction, because corrections are what you make when the math has been wrong long enough to confuse people into believing it was right. I told them that my parents had missed my wedding because they were at a surprise party, that I had not made that detail up or exaggerated it, and that the wound it caused was real. And then I invited my parents to stand and say the single sentence we had agreed on, the one that acknowledged the absence and the choice and the consequence. My mother's hand trembled when she took the microphone, but she spoke the line exactly as written, saying they had skipped their daughter's wedding for a party and that they knew it hurt. And my father added that they intended to do better because love without accountability is neglect in better clothing, and the room was silent in the way that happens when a truth finally lands. My parents returned to their seats with relief on their faces, as though confession were a key and not just a statement. But before the moment could settle, Emily rose, brushing past me with a whisper that smelled of perfume and resentment, and asked to deliver her 2 minutes on sisterhood. She took the microphone with the flair of someone who had always mistaken attention for authority, and she began talking about how blood is thicker than grudges, and how siblings must forgive because jealousy poisons the well. Words that sounded rehearsed in front of a mirror, but what she had not accounted for was the microphone recording every syllable, and the attorney seated quietly in the back with a copy of her earlier message threatening to strip me of what had been left to me. When she tried to pivot into a plea for me to share the estate for the sake of appearances, I stepped forward, placed my hand gently on the microphone, and told her that time was up. I looked out at the room and explained that forgiveness is not a currency you can demand, that it is something earned through honesty and change, and that my grandparents had entrusted me with their estate not because I begged, but because they had watched and decided for themselves. I reminded the guests that the fund at the entrance was the real celebration, that the checks in those envelopes would support students who deserved opportunity, and that this day was not about rewriting photographs, but about telling the truth while people were alive to hear it. The applause that followed was not raucous, but steady, the kind of applause that says people see through the fog, and when I stepped aside to let the coordinator collect the microphone, I felt lighter than I had in years. As the evening wound down, my parents hovered near me with hopeful smiles, asking if this meant we could finally begin again, and I told them we could begin something, but that it would not look like what they imagined. I said they had spoken their acknowledgement and written their donation, that both actions mattered, but that a single sentence and a check do not erase the weight of a chair left empty on the most important day of my life, and that moving forward would require them to show up consistently without scripts or staging. Emily stormed out before dessert, muttering about betrayal and ingratitude, but I let her leave without following, because I had learned that chasing people who do not want to stay is how you get lost in the first place. When the last guest left and the checks were locked safely in the scholarship account, I stood in the quiet hall with Mark's arm around me, and I realized the aisle I had walked was never about flowers or dresses or cameras. It was about drawing a line that forced everyone to see which side they chose. I did not remarry for my parents. I did not redo anything. I simply staged a moment that exposed the truth and sealed it in front of witnesses. And when my parents asked again the next week whether we could plan family holidays together, I told them they were welcome to reach out, but that I would decide case by case, because love is not unconditional when conditions are the only thing that make it survive. That night I played both voicemails again, the first one with the promise of someday and the second with the clumsy excuses, and I deleted them both, not because they no longer mattered, but because I no longer needed proof to defend myself. I had built my own proof, in front of a room full of people, and the story was finished on my terms. My parents got their aisle, but it led them not to a fantasy where they could erase the past. It led them to the truth, and I walked it knowing that for the first time in my life, I had won without having to argue. Because the applause in that room told me the only verdict that mattered.